welcome everyone to today's Dig Deeper webinar. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on all the lands on which we meet here today, which for me here in Brisbane is the Jagera and Derbarl people. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce Rebecca and then hand over to her in a minute. So Rebecca is a conservation geneticist. She works across Australia and overseas, and her research guides where to source seeds to promote resilient future climates and the seeds that are resilient to those climates, and also in priority areas for conservation. So it's a great pleasure to be having Rebecca speaking with us today. I'm going to hand over to you, Rebecca, and just a reminder that if you have questions, please add them to the chat and we'll come back and take them all at the end. So over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you so much everyone for joining in today and being here. It's a real pleasure to present. As Tom mentioned, I'm Beck Jordan. I'm a research scientist at CSIRO and I'm a conservation geneticist. I'm really fascinated by the variation that exists within species, how that relates to the environments that they grow in, and what that means for adaptability in our really changing climates and environments. And one application in particular of this work is thinking about restoration and how we source seed to make plantings more resilient in these changing climates, both now and into the future. Today, I have the pleasure of presenting on this CRC TiME project, which I lead with a whole group of people, including the amazing site leads that are mentioned there and our fantastic partners in this project who make it possible. I know this is a lot of information on this front slide, but it really shows the breadth of people coming together and really who I'm presenting on behalf of today. So this project is looking to develop evidence for the effectiveness of climate-adapted seed sourcing strategies for revegetation success and transition to mine closure in a changing climate. Extending beyond Tom's acknowledgement, I'd also just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the custodians and the lands of which we are all calling in from today and where we work and live. For me, I'd like to acknowledge the Muanina people of Nipaluna as the traditional owners of the lands that I'm presenting from, and the Paluapakana people as the continuing custodians of the wider lands of Lutruwita down here in Tasmania. And especially when we're talking about ecology, I'd really like to acknowledge the long, deep and ongoing connection with country of our traditional owners. And I'd also like to welcome any traditional owners, Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who are here today. So why restoration? So we can define restoration as the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged or destroyed. And this is especially pertinent in the world we live in today, with an estimated over 75% of terrestrial land has been impacted in some way by humans. And so within a mining context, restoration is obviously a really key component in that transition to mine closure, helping restore ecosystems and to meet regulatory or legal obligations where these may be applicable towards that closure and relinquishment. But it has broader significance than that. There's this really growing understanding of the importance of healthy ecosystems at a whole range of scales. So when we're thinking about business and corporate, the World Economic Forum has listed biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse as one of the top 10 risks in the next 10 years towards the economy. We have a number of initiatives that are really looking to capture and understand and articulate the dependencies, impacts, the risks and opportunities that businesses have in relation to their natural capital assets and those natural systems. And more broadly, when we're seeing even wider at the global scale, we're currently in the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and the recent Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework has targets around the restoration and conservation of our natural systems. And so we're seeing really increased community expectations as well as this global imperative to protect and restore our natural systems. So this all goes hand in hand when we're thinking about mine closure of not only restoring that ecosystem, but really thinking about how this action can be enhancing at those greater scales and helping to maintain that social license to operate as well. So getting it right, therefore, has a lot of implications at many levels. At that local level, we're restoring that mine site and meeting those obligations towards closure. At regional scales, we're meeting those community and landscape and biodiversity goals and expectations about healthy ecosystems. And then at that broader national and global scale, we're thinking about those corporate initiatives. We're thinking about biodiversity and society more broadly, as collectively we're working to protect and restore these natural systems that we're critically dependent on. The challenge we have with restoration is that we're working in a really dynamic and changing environment. Last year was the warmest year on record and saw the end of the warmest 10-year period on global record. Australia's temperature has increased by 1.4 degrees since 1910. As well as these increases, we're seeing increased frequency of extreme events and increased intensity. And these climate change impacts are starting to be seen on our species, our biodiversity, and our ecosystems, certainly here in Australia, but also worldwide. And we've got climate projections and ecological modelling that predict significant changes into the future as well. So in this really changing environment, how do we create plantings that are going to be resilient in the longer term? So when we think about restoration as a whole, what we're really aiming to create are these biodiverse, self-sustaining populations into the longer term. And so when we're thinking about this changing world, how can we do that to maximise the outcomes? In terms of revegetation, traditionally we've used what's called local provenancing. So it's collecting the seed from the local area that's assumed to be most adapted to those local conditions and therefore most fit. We have a lovely example here of Eucalyptus gunnii from central Tasmania, where we can see that that local provenance, those open circles, had greater survival than the non-local provenance in those closed circles. However, this local provenancing doesn't recognise this dynamic system that we're now working in. And especially when we're talking about long-lived species, what we can end up with climate change is a mismatch between the climate that they're optimally adapted to and the current climate at a site, such that the local plants may no longer be most adapted to local conditions. And going back to this Eucalyptus gunnii example, over the 35 years that this planting was monitored, there was an increase in temperature over time, a decrease in precipitation, to the point where that local provenance wasn't the most fit anymore. The one that was able to survive in the longer term was that non-local provenance, the one that was from the slightly warmer area, the slightly drier area. So in these really altered and dynamic changing conditions, the challenge we have for restoration is that we're not simply preserving the presence of species in a sort of a static form. We need to conserve the capacity to change, that ability to adapt to whatever is coming. And genetic variation is a really important component of this. That's the variation within a species that's going to enable them to adapt and evolve to new conditions. And so the reason that we're considering other seed sourcing strategies and how we might be able to incorporate this genetic variation is because genetic variation isn't constant across the range of a species. It differs just due to distance, or what we call drift, when areas are really far from each other, but it can also be driven by response to environment. So across the range of a species, they might range across a climate gradient, and so different areas are adapted to different components of that climate gradient. And this can create really important differences even within a species that we could potentially utilise for restoration. So by identifying that natural variation, we might be able to find that adaptation to climate that we could incorporate. And so we see this in a wide number of traits across a wide range of species. So we see difference in leaf traits and growth. We see differences in flowering, And this is related to a range of climate factors, including temperature and precipitation. If we're thinking about things like flowering time or deciduous species, cold and frost can come into that as well. And we see examples here in Australia of this. This is Eucalyptus microcarpa, the grey box eucalypt, and we can see the differences in leaf traits associated with mean annual temperature. In this little beautiful yam daisy, Microceras walteri, we see differences in germination temperatures. So in the top had a cooler germination temperature, that solid vertical line and grey banding, and in the bottom provenance had a slightly higher germination temperature. But a really interesting thing here as well is looking in that top plot, you can see that provenance as temperatures increased across to the right, their ability to germinate drops up significantly, whereas that other provenance, same species, can withstand those hotter temperatures and still germinate. So we have this variation, which these differences are in part the rationale of local provenancing, but in a changing climate, they're also an opportunity to increase diversity and increase pre-adapted variation that might be more resilient to warmer conditions, such as those warmer temperatures, and therefore enhance adaptability and long-term success of revegetation plantings. So I like to think about genetic variation as a toolkit. The more tools you have in that kit, the more resilient you are, but also the more tools that are specific to the conditions you will likely experience, the more chance you're going to have of adapting. And so this has led to the proposal of a number of alternative seed sourcing strategies for restoration. So moving beyond that local provenancing in the top left corner there, we have ones that look to increase genetic diversity generally to help increase general resilience. And that's a composite provenancing and a mixture provenancing in the bottom left. But then we have some across on the right that are looking specifically at thinking about introducing that climate adapted diversity. So in particular, that climate adjusted provenancing, where we have some material from the local area and some material across the distribution, as shown by those green circles, but we're thinking about the direction of climate change so we can hopefully capture some of that pre-adapted diversity that exists within a species and include that in our restoration planting. And to provide a bit of broader context of where these sit, there are a number of conservation options that we're thinking about under climate change as we seriously consider how we're going to conserve and protect our species as well as restore our species in this really changing conditions. And this is some work by Suzanne Prober and colleagues where they reviewed a number of options and were able to put them into this typology, this matrix, that was looking at along the vertical axis whether the action was trying to evade or ameliorate against the changing conditions and functions through to building adaptive capacity specifically, as well as management options that were across the horizontal axis, low risk, so those low risk, low regret options through to climate targeted options. And just to let you know, this idea of thinking about using non-local provenances fits within that typology and is one of these aspects that we're considering more broadly for conservation under climate change. But the really tricky thing with all of these, especially these revegetation alternative strategies, they're based on really sound data and knowledge that we have about variation within species. However, we don't actually have empirical data on how these play out in a real world context. So in that broader review that was done, less than 10% of studies had field data providing experimental empirical evidence for the effectiveness of these proposed strategies. Indeed, most were based on really sound ecological reasoning from really sound data and knowledge we have about our species, or models or simulations. So building on this information, what we need now is to take this knowledge, to take these proposed actions and then really test them in the field and develop that evidence for these different strategies into the future to guide our restoration. And so that's where this project comes in. So in this project, what we aim to do is to test the effectiveness of those climate adapted seed sourcing strategies for post-mine revegetation, to build that empirical database that can really help guide us as we go forward into revegetation in a really changing climate. And so we're aiming to provide that evidence that can guide into the future to increase climate resilience, reduce that risk of failure, both now and into the future. And the CRC is just such an ideal opportunity to do this, being this nationwide initiative with so many partners across Australia as well that are engaged in large-scale restoration work in many regions and many contexts. So it provides this really wonderful opportunity to test these different options embedded in normal revegetation operations in real-world contexts across Australia to really build that really strong evidence base. So today I'm going to be talking through the components that we've got in this project. So we're at about the halfway point at the moment. So I'll talk about what we have done to date and what we're looking to do into the future for the remainder of the project as well. So I'll be talking through these different aspects of that initial establishing this network of experimental plantings, which is really our research infrastructure that underpins this, this project. The data that we're going to look to collect on this alternative climate adapted seed sourcing strategy that's then going to lead to us being able to identify some generalisations and build that evidence for industry and regulators to guide mine closure that has greater climate resilience. And also dovetailed in with that is really demonstrating how this experimental design and the use of a network can really enhance our understandings, not just now, but into the future as we grow this further. And obviously all of these going towards that aim of really being able to provide that guidance around increasing climate resilience and reducing risk of failure. And while we're talking about the mining context here, this is work that's also going to be really applicable to restoration more broadly as well. Climate change is a challenge that restoration worldwide is having to face, along with a number of other challenges. And as I mentioned, these are really largely untested strategies. There hasn't been much work to date to build that empirical evidence. So this is also really an amazing opportunity for the mining industry to be really leading in this space of thinking about how we can do restoration differently to enhance resilience into climate change. So starting with that first component, so establishing these experimental plantings. So we've got 5 locations across Australia where we're establishing these, 3 across southern Australia and 2 further up in the north. And we have this incredible breadth of partners, as you saw briefly on the first slide, that are contributing to this. And so it's working with a number of sectors coming together, which is a real power of these sorts of projects, to bring together that diverse knowledge and understanding to work together to address these really tricky challenges. And so I just really want to shout out, this is just such an amazing group to work with, of really dedicated and engaged people working towards this challenge. So a big shout out to all of you and your thanks for being involved in this project. It's really awesome. And so what all of our plantings have underneath them is this core experimental design. And that's what's going to enable us to collect results from all those different sites and compare them to create these generalisations, or to find these generalisations. By having that same core design replicated, we can ask the same question at different sites. And so what we have at its core is testing local provenancing, so using that local seed, compared to revegetation that is using mixed provenancing, so that climate adjusted provenancing, including local material, but also material from further afield, in particular towards climates that are expected at that site in the future. One of the really unique things about this project, though, that's really exciting is that, in contrast to other work that looks at the fitness of those different provenances individually, what we're really interested in is what is the outcome for the revegetation as a whole? How are we working towards achieving that biodiverse, long-term sustainable revegetation? So each of these plots are a mix of multiple different species, thinking about how we would do restoration normally, and looking to ask, how does the performance of the revegetation as a whole happen with this mixed seed sourcing strategy? How does it compare to the traditional local strategy? And what are the outcomes in this context? And so today what we've got are 4 of our revegetation plantings planted out, which is really exciting, with a couple more on the way. I've got a little dot there for Southwest WA, which I'm going to touch on a little bit later. So we didn't have great success with our first planting there. We've got a whole heap of learnings that are coming off it, and we're going to continue monitoring that site to see what it does into the future as well. And so we've got these 4 experimental sites, which translate to over 10,000 seeds and seedlings that have gone into the ground, over 15 different species across all of these sites, different mining contexts, different ecosystems. So it's really showing the power that you can start to have when you have a network of sites, that you can cover this real breadth to be able to learn about how this strategy might apply. Also, this is really designed to go beyond the life of this project as well. So this is designed to be long-term experimental infrastructure. So these are assets that can provide ongoing data for adaptive management into the future. And this is captured in this idea of future practice, as mentioned in the International Principles and Standards for Ecological Restoration and Recovery of Mine Sites. So this idea of future practice is building in monitoring and review that can enable evidence-based management and practices to improve outcomes, especially when the changes are unknown, which is exactly the situation we're working in. So we're going to be gathering data, but we hope that this will also be able to continue giving data into the future, especially sort of 5-10 years time, to really understand how these play out as we really start to see significant changes. So moving on to this second component, as we have these restoration plantings set up, we're now starting to move into this phase of really developing that empirical evidence. So addressing that knowledge gap of how these play out in real world contexts. So we're looking to ask what the performance is of the climate adapted seed sourcing strategies versus that business as usual local strategy on restoration outcomes. And we're really interested in both above ground, so sort of what we traditionally see in restoration, our plants and our vegetation coming back, but also the soil microbiome, which is an exciting extra component to put on. And as I mentioned earlier, our primary question is again around that performance of the revegetation as a whole. So what is the influence of using these alternative strategies on that success of developing biodiverse, long-term sustainable plantings and building new ecosystems into the future? So if we think about just that vegetation component initially, as I mentioned earlier, we have this natural variation in fitness and performance. This isn't an Australian example, but I just love this picture on the right here. It's the Sitka spruce in North America. And you can see just in this little planting along this wall, the difference across the range from California down to Alaska in how this plant grows in response to the environments where it came from. So we've got this really inherent variation there already. And on the left, you can also see this variation in response. Whilst it looks like there are some areas that aren't planted, it's actually a planted area, and you're seeing the vegetation come back in different ways. And this is what we're really interested in. What is that performance of that vegetation as a whole when we use this alternative strategy? And so to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to monitor the vegetation over time. So we've planted these plants or seedlings in the ground, and we want to see their response over time, over the next coming years, as well as really into the future. And so for this, we're thinking about that revegetation success. So how well are these plantings surviving? That canopy cover, or that growth, as well as species diversity, especially in the long term. So we've focused on some target species within each of our plantings, so some of our structural dominant species. But what we'd hope to see over time is increasing diversity as well. And in fact, we're starting to see that at a couple of our locations, some seeds that are potentially in the seed bank are also coming in and contributing to these plantings, which is really exciting. Longer term, not quite in the scope of the project at the moment, but also hoping to think about genetic diversity as well. And what are the implications for these alternative strategies for capturing that genetic diversity that we're aiming to in these plantings? And while we're looking at that revegetation as a whole, as I mentioned, we still do have the capacity in our design to look at that individual performance of the different provenances, which is going to help continue to feed that knowledge bank underpinning these strategies as well. So we're getting these two wonderful layers of information coming off of our plantings. And then when we think about the other component, the soil microbiome, so the soil microbiome is this really diverse community that has been really difficult to study in the past. So it's incredibly important for modulating the soil environment, for making nutrients available to plants. It plays a role in plant health and productivity, as well as contributing to soil food webs. And it includes a range of bacteria and fungi and other microorganisms. The trouble we've had in the past is that most of these we either can't culture or can't see under a microscope. So they've remained relatively unknown. But with genomics and advancing DNA technologies, we now have the possibility of extracting the DNA directly from soils and then being able to use parts of the sequence to actually identify who's there and give us this really rich understanding of what's happening below ground that we haven't had before. This is a beautiful example from South Australia in looking at the soil microbiome in a cleared site, a number of revegetation sites of different ages, and then comparing that to the remnant sites. So this is, for those who aren't familiar, this is a principal component plot. The dots that are closer together are more similar, the dots that are more dissimilar are further apart. And what we see generally is from the cleared across to the remnants, we see the revegetation becoming more like the remnants as they age, with this beautiful trajectory from our cleared sites in the red through to our remnant sites in the blue, showing that it's not just the above ground that is restoring when we do restoration, but our below ground biodiversity is also returning. So we're really interested in exploring that here as well. So we're going to be sampling the soil over time to look at how the soil microbiome shifts as well in response to our alternative seed sourcing strategies. And so we're going to be focusing here on a number of aspects, including species richness, community composition, the relative abundance of particular taxa, but also the functional potential. So with these data, we can look at what the potential function of some of these microbes are and understand what might be some of the key processes that are happening in the soil. And so for this, we're going to be extracting that DNA from the soil, as I mentioned, and then performing bioinformatics to end up with this really high quality data. And that's what's represented in the graph on the right. Don't worry about the detail unless you're a bioinformatician and you really want to know the detail there. What I really want you to take away is this is quite a detailed process to take the enormous data that we get from sequencing and really filter, process and quality check that to end up with this really high quality data at the end that enables us to identify the soil microbes and to really analyse that community data to look at what's happening when we change the way we source seeds and the way we implement our revegetation above ground. So we're just at this point in terms of assessing performance, we're literally just starting to get our first data off our experimental plantings. So we don't quite have anything to share as yet, but please do stay tuned because we're really excited as this data starts to roll in and we start to be able to look at what some of these similarities and differences might be across our sites and what we can tell and think about in terms of building that evidence base for climate adapted seed sourcing. But even with the data just coming in, there's still a lot of learnings and outcomes to date. And this is something that, to be honest, I've been quite really pleasantly surprised by. I was, as a scientist, thinking about that data that I really wanted to dive into. But we've also learnt a lot along the way as we've gone to implement these experimental plantings. And I just wanted to touch on a few of those as we hit this halfway mark in the project. So in terms of wins, we realise we have so much existing knowledge already about how to collect, propagate, and grow and put seeds and seedlings into the ground. This is something that a number of sectors have worked on for quite some time. We have really deep knowledge there. We're seeing biodiversity return. As I mentioned, at a couple of sites, we have some non-target species there, which is really great and really allows us to think about what's the effect of these climate-adapted seed sourcing strategies. If we can get that for the structural dominant species, how does that help that biodiversity as a whole? Some really wonderful Indigenous engagement in the Pilbara with Indigenous trainees helping to grow the seedlings, really demonstrating how restoration is just this really wonderful space that can draw people from so many sectors coming together to work collectively and bring together our collective knowledge to achieve better outcomes. And in that vein as well, really the power of these science industry collaborations. So drawing together the practical as well as the scientific knowledge to really understand how these work in the real world, what we can learn from that, and therefore what guidance we can provide going forward. We also have a number of challenges, as anything with field work does. There's only so much you can control. And so we've had challenges around site legacy. As I mentioned, that site in Southwest WA, we've had a lot of challenges with weeds and other site legacy issues at that location. But there's a real learning there as well of what are the things that we need to think about that work in conjunction with our seed sourcing strategies to achieve those better outcomes. So as I mentioned, we're going to keep monitoring that site because we still want to keep learning from that site into the future and see what comes up. Also learning about the logistics of sourcing seed from so many provenances. When we're not just trying to get seed from one location, what are the logistics involved and what are the things that can help facilitate collecting that breadth of seed that we need for those climate adapted strategies? And so from that, we're collecting a lot of learnings about the variation that we see when we're out collecting seed and trying to germinate seed from quite a number of areas around that site preparation and the importance of legacy, and also the real power of those collaborations that we have across different sectors that can really contribute to our learnings. And all of this as well is coming together to not only develop that evidence for the effectiveness of alternative seed sourcing strategies, but through this process, we're also understanding more broadly the logistics, which can help contribute towards things like the development of restoration economies into the future. By having this knowledge and guidelines in place that are backed by this evidence-based knowledge that we're developing, we can really assist some of those initiatives into the future to be really successful. And so finally, I just wanted to as well touch on this broader network and the power that we have when we do something across multiple sites, not just at one site. So if we did this at one site, we would learn something really, really interesting about that site. We would learn something really interesting about those species. But how applicable it is to other locations, to other mining contexts, to other species would be a little bit unknown. When we use a network though, we really have the power to start identifying what are the generalizations, what are the similarities, where are the differences that can really build that evidence base and guide future revegetation in a post-mining context. So in our site, our project alone, we've got 5 experimental sites across a range of mining contexts. We've got over 15 species, over 5 different ecosystems. Were this to grow, and if we had another however many sites, even one site added in, it wouldn't just be that one site, it would be a richness of data that comes by that learning at that one site, that single site information, but then feeding into this bigger network that again helps us really understand the depth of similarities and differences and how this climate adjusted seed sourcing can perform in different areas. And so just to summarise, to come together, at the moment, we've got our revegetation plantings in the ground. We've still got a couple to come, but we have some in the ground. We're just starting to pull off that first data, so that first empirical evidence of these sites that's going to lead towards us being able to start thinking about and developing that evidence for industry and regulators around how we can enhance climate resilience. And also showing how this network approach and having that core design can really enhance the outcomes that we get from this type of work, all leading towards, as I mentioned, that real aim of increasing climate resilience and reducing the risk of failure, both now and into this really dynamic and changing world that we're living into. With that, I would really just love to acknowledge this is just such a broad capture of the number of people who have been involved in this. This really doesn't happen without a lot of effort from a lot of different people. And so I just want to express my deep gratitude to everyone who's been involved. Apologies if your specific name hasn't been listed on here. There are just so many people out there, and your ongoing support in this project going forward. And with that, I will wrap up. Say thank you so much for listening and pass back to Tom for any questions. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Beck. And there's a couple of questions already, and really welcome any additional questions if people like to just add them into the chat. So, well, that's a great presentation. And I'll just go to the first question we have here.
Sure.
Do you manage for pests, or is that part of the survival comparison?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's something that we've been discussing. So we have had, well, pests was one of the issues at one of the sites that we didn't manage for, and unfortunately had an impact. At our other sites, we aren't. There hasn't been, I think, a big pest issue to consider. We have been considering how we deal with weeds, though, at a number of sites, and how we can think about managing those in a way where we're not going to damage the plants themselves as well, but try and hold back the impact of those so the plants can get up. So that's something we're exploring at the moment. Obviously, it's also something to consider when we're doing these really large scale restoration projects. What are the actions we could take that could work at scale? For example, if we're talking about weeding, hand weeding when you're talking about hectares is not possible. So what are the actions that we can take? So yeah, so pests in themselves we haven't controlled for. Weeds are something that we're contending with and learning about at the moment.
Awesome. So next question is, was the soil biology analysed in the potting mix of the tube stock prior to planting into the site? It probably would be the same within one site, but could it differ between sites and different potting mixes?
Yeah, absolutely. It absolutely could. The potting mix isn't something that we have looked at. We're more interested, but absolutely, I do take your point that there is a microbiome there that could be looked at. What we're really interested in, though, is what's happening really at that site level. So thinking about, once the plants start growing beyond their potting mix and into the natural soil environments. So it's not something that we have at the moment, but is a really, really great point to raise.
Awesome. Okay. Well, the next one is, do you have any learnings yet relating to sourcing seed from multiple diverse locations? So I guess it's a question on what are your kind of early findings or any early lessons?
Early lessons. So in terms of, say, the response in ground, we're literally just starting to get that data off in the past week or so. So we don't have any information at that yet. It's brand new data that we've got to get into and analyse. A personal reflection from myself in this really is thinking about the logistics associated with sourcing seed from multiple locations. Obviously, it's more challenge. I want to say more challenging. It's a different logistic exercise. You're not just going to one place and getting one bulk amount of seed. So it's really thinking about how we can tap into existing networks, how we can utilise collections that have occurred across the landscape and feed in. So I think there's more discussion to be had and some thinking, I think, between all the partners in this project about what that means in a logistic sense and what are the factors that would help facilitate that going forward. So it's work in progress as we're finishing off our final plantings, but certainly something we're thinking about. So yeah, watch this space. We hope to have more in future.
So the next question, are the plants inoculated with mycorrhizal flora to help establishment? Sorry,
could you just repeat that question, Tom? I missed little bits of that.
Yeah, I'm just reading it as it's written. Are the plants inoculated with mycorrhizal flora to help establishment?
No, so we haven't done any inoculations here. So there is some thinking and work just for others' interest about, can we, knowing the importance of the soil microbiome, can we inoculate the soil microbiome to give these plants a kickstart? So that's not something that we're looking at in this project. Definitely something interesting in restoration more broadly. So we're just looking at what the native flora currently is at those sites, and by bringing in those different species, and as I said, as they expand and grow, how their presence and their interactions with the soil, because plants interact with the soil and they can exude particular chemicals to enhance particular microbes to be there. So what that influence is of their presence on the soil microbiome that currently exists at that site.
Bit of a theme here. So question on what sort of site preparation is being done? Does it vary from site to site?
Yeah, so it does a little. So we do have a number of different mining contexts. So the site preparation that's done varies slightly. A lot of it is around just physical changes to the site. So either flattening the site, returning topsoil to the site in some situations. So, that topsoil potentially comes with a seed bank in it. Other sites, it's spoil slopes. So it's slopes that are being entirely manufactured, that have a quite different soil chemistry. So there might be this physical ripping to create a more amenable environment to plant into. As I mentioned, some of the sites we're dealing with weeds as well. So we've had some application of herbicides to try and address weeds. It's a bit of a balance because we're obviously wanting herbicides that are going to get rid of the weeds we want, but not affect the plants that we put in. So that's a little bit of a delicate balance there. But yes, it does vary between sites, but a lot of the site preparation, certainly in terms of this project, has been around just physically returning the site to something that we can plant into.
Okay. So the next question, let me just read it. There's a bit of a context, and then the question comes after. So, notwithstanding climate adaptation, with mine sites often sitting within expansive pastoral leases and both areas extensively cleared of local species. So the question is, will our hand be forced when it comes to introducing species from outside specified provenance zones? So there's a kind of a question there about the context and the surrounding pastoral leases.
Yep.
Does the work have something you'd like to comment on that? I mean, or is that perhaps one for a subsequent discussion?
Sorry, was that?
Yeah, do you have any comments on the question?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I wasn't sure if that was to the question asker or myself. Yeah, absolutely. So for a lot of the species that we're looking to rehabilitate, they really have quite wide distributions. So there are going to be a lot of species that, even if there are quite extensively cleared areas around the mine site, that those species still likely exist in the wider landscape more generally. So I'm not sure if I'm interpreting the question correctly, but in terms of, say, forcing hands to, if we were to change species, I think there's still a large breadth of the species distribution of what was originally there that could be considered without having to change to other species at this point. In terms of the local, yeah, absolutely. There's something where there's certainly a tension between, say, using that local and the fact that, as you're suggesting, local either doesn't exist because it has been cleared so much, or even if it does exist, it exists as a few paddock trees or small remnants, which actually have their own issues when we're talking about seed collecting. When you have only a few trees together, the seed is more likely to be what's called inbred. So it's going to have lower fitness. It may not be as diverse just because there's fewer trees that are contributing to that seed load. And so whilst it's local, it actually has other issues associated with it. So it may actually be better in those situations to collect from further afield where you have a much larger stand of trees, which is more genetically diverse, and that can bring that diversity and resilience in. So there's absolutely, I think, a challenge when we have that local landscape is cleared, is as well as climate change, do we try and stick to whatever small vegetation we can find there, or are we going to be better to go further afield, get that diverse seed lots, those healthier seed lots, and bring them into site? I hope that contributes to the comment and question and answers that.
Thanks, Meg. So a few more questions, and so the next one is, there's some indication that certain plants bioaccumulate HMs. Will this be monitored for the various trials? It may be that some materials are more resistant, maybe an additional factor as well as climate adaptation.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're not looking at that. I'm making the assumption HM there is heavy metals, I think is the assumption. But anyway, we're not looking at that, but absolutely there are so many other aspects to any restoration. So we're really focused on this climate adapted component, given that we've got changing climates. But one of the aspects of thinking about that I mentioned earlier is making sure we keep genetic diversity as a whole, because there are going to be a number of other factors that this revegetation is going to be challenged with. Things like heavy metals and these really altered mine landscapes as well are some of those components. So it's not just climate. So here we're thinking about that climate aspect to better understand that, but also thinking about, can we make sure we create genetically diverse plantings as well, so that they're resilient to these other factors that we're not necessarily measuring in this project, but may be important as well and important into the future.
Okay, so I'm going to read the next one. So the next one is 15 plus species over these wide variety of sites could not be considered a biodiverse restoration at any of these sites singly. Restoration is about establishing the whole ecosystem, not individual species. Do you expect the assessment of performance in the experimental design, particularly of individual species, to translate into performance of restoration more broadly?
Yeah, so obviously what we're working with is only a small snapshot. I think with many experiments, there's a logistic component where we need to be able to do something that we can get some understanding of to inform more broadly. So at each of these sites, yes, as you say, 15 isn't necessarily many in terms of ecological restoration, but we're really focused on those structural dominant species, thinking about, as you say, that there are going to be a lot of other species that are going to come in over time. But if we get those structural dominants in and we get that really established and have success there, can that then lead to being sort of a catalyst or a core for restoration of those other species coming in, whether that be subsequent plantings in the future or whether that be like we're seeing at a couple of sites where we're starting to get natural recruitment coming in underneath. So it's thinking about really what we're doing in terms of current restoration efforts and trying to think about what are the changes that we can make to those efforts. What are the different ways that we can approach that might enhance success towards that restoration as a whole. So certainly when we're doing restoration, there's usually a finite number of species that we put in, just again, sheer logistics. But thinking about those, how can we best put those in that's going to set this site up to head to that trajectory that we're after, exactly as you say, of a biodiverse ecological restoration.
No, thanks, that makes sense. So next question is, will introducing mixed provenance species impact the fauna, etc., that rely on the local provenance species? At what stage will you or could the local environmental stakeholders be involved, i.e. land care?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think that's one of the real importance of when we're thinking about these climate adapted strategies is that they still contain some of that local provenance material as well, because we know that there are going to be other associations, exactly as you're suggesting, with fauna and other organisms that may be important. So we're not disregarding the local, rather we're augmenting the local with other provenances that might help with the resilience into the future. These are going to be quite young plantings, so interactions with fauna at this point in time are not going to be something that we're going to be looking at over the next year or so. But when I spoke about these being long-term research infrastructure, that's where some of those really interesting questions can start coming in. When they start getting larger, when they start being able to perform some of those habitat or food or other roles for other biodiversity, particular fauna, that's when we can start to come in and start looking at what those effects are. So the hope is, while we're looking at vegetation and the soil microbiome here, these can be ongoing research infrastructure that as they mature, we can start to look at these other factors that start to move in and come into play.
Right. So we have a question here which relates to First Nation interests going forward when the proponent left the mine site and land is returned to relevant Indigenous group. What is in place for the local Indigenous people to benefit from the country, i.e. heritage, values, and living on country value? These questions are considered from mining sector researchers in terms of traditional living. So that's the question there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really great question. Here we're thinking about returning that biodiversity that was originally at the site in the hope of returning this as best we can to that functional ecosystem. But absolutely, there's a really important component with Indigenous knowledge of not only thinking about those aspects that you said, but working together to understand, well, what's the best way that these sites could be restored going forward to meet all those different stakeholder, sorry, the word has escaped me, beg your pardon, to meet all those end values that people have. So obviously there is an interest in restoring that, but from an Indigenous perspective, exactly as you're suggesting, what is the role of this restoration and how can it be done in a way that's sensitive to that? As I mentioned earlier, this is really focused on that climate adapted component. So where there's, as all these questions are suggesting, there's so many aspects to thinking about restoration and how we get it to where we want it to be. And so this one we've chosen that climate adapted aspect, but that's absolutely a really important aspect. And I think an aspect that we'd really love to dive into further going forward beyond this, of really bringing in that engagement and understanding of, well, what is going to be important here beyond the life of the mine as well. So bringing that in. I hope that's answered your question.
No worries. So what I'm going to do is there's still a couple of questions left. In case we run out of time, I'm going to start at the bottom and then go up. So because we had quite a few already, but one's just snuck in. How much on-ground trials of plant provenance and associated geo-regional climate adaptiveness have been completed nationally or globally, or has much of the discussion been theoretical today?
There are so many plantings around Australia and around the world. There's a real depth of literature. The forestry industry is one really large component of that, which goes back quite some ways globally as foresters were thinking about provenance and where to source seed. So we actually have quite a rich history in the differences within a species and how they relate to climate that I mentioned earlier. And that's across Australia as well. There's been a lot of plantings and a lot of experiments over the years thinking about for various questions, for various different applications, but really thinking about what's that different performance of different provenances in an environment to try and tackle a particular environmental issue. So we have a really rich data set when we're talking about understanding variation within species. And it's something that's still growing and we're still learning, but we have a lot of empirical data there to draw on. What we're doing here is trying to build on that empirical data and take that knowledge and test it out in a conservation action that has then been proposed, these alternative seed sourcing strategies. So they've built on this data, but now we have a proposal based on that knowledge, and we want to test that, how that plays out when we try these alternative conservation actions.
That's awesome. So yeah, we're getting very close to time, but we'll try and squeeze in a couple of questions, a couple more last ones. So will the trial look at direct seeding versus tube stock planting? Could there be an interaction between genetic diversity and the type of plant reintroduction?
Yeah, so we're not testing directly direct seeding versus tube stock, but we do have a mix of seeding and seedlings going into our sites. So it's not a direct test, but we do have that diversity of alternative plantings. And yes, as you could imagine, there may be differences as to whether you have grown something and got it past that germination stage and put it in versus something where the seeds have to germinate themselves. And so it's something that will be part of our data set, even though we're not explicitly testing for that difference in terms of, say, having one species that we're doing both direct seeding and planting for. Really what we're doing in the situation of, say, the direct seeding versus the planting is really following the business as usual at a site. So again, coming back to that thinking about if we do our business as usual revegetation, but we try this different seed sourcing strategy, do we get enhanced climate resilience and enhanced outcomes from that?
Sounds good. Last question. So last question is, will the spread of the new genetics away from the site be monitored? i.e., is this a short study or a really long-term study?
It's both. So it's not something we're doing at the moment. We've got these, this short-term project, but it's, as I mentioned, our aim is for it to be long-term research infrastructure. So those sort of questions move into that long-term research infrastructure, which is naturally reliant on that work going forward. But it's certainly a really interesting question to be asked, and is going to be applicable in different situations in different ways. Where we do have that natural vegetation nearby, that's a really interesting question of how that may mix and integrate. But then others, as was suggested by another question, there are some where the mining is surrounded by a lot of pastoral land and some of our native species aren't even there at that point in time. So thinking about, it's certainly something that we're thinking about, and it's something that the revegetation community as a whole is really cognizant about. You know, when we're thinking about these alternative seed sourcing strategies, it really is balancing the thinking about the benefit of those non-local provenances, as well as other things that come into play around what it means for the local environment too. But really thinking about that we've got some really critical challenges in terms of that climate adaptation and making sure that we have revegetation that's resilient in the first place to be at those sites.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It's been really good. There's been a very engaged audience. Thank you all for the rich questions. I will just mention that Ben's just posted in the chat, soon we'll be starting a Restoring Country webinar series, which explores First Nations leadership, involvement and perspectives on mine closure and post-mining transition. So please do look out for those announcements as well. And thank you so much for tuning in. And once again, thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Thank you.